All right, so the endocrine system. So we're going to touch on its functions in maintaining homeostasis. We start with a big overview where we talk about hormones and receptors and their effects and the general negative feedback loops that we see for regulating hormones. And then we're going to get into the actual endocrine organs and their hormones and their effects. So the endocrine system is our other major homeostatic regulator. And unlike the nervous system, which is going to exert its influence by synapsing with effectors, the endocrine system releases hormones, which are chemical messengers, and they're released into the blood. And so they're traveling in extracellular fluids where they then find cells with receptors and they alter their metabolic function. We can't really deal with one system or the other in a vacuum because they're both working together to regulate and control the body. Now, the nervous system is much faster acting than the endocrine system, so it has a much faster reaction time, but the effects of the endocrine system are typically longer lasting, much longer lasting. And there is some overlap between these systems, as we'll touch on, as far as like dual controls and stuff like that. But generally speaking, whenever something needs a fairly rapid response, the nervous system is going to be in charge. And things that are that can have slower responses, that need to last longer, that are more, you know, rhythmic or cyclical, we see that more as the realm of the endocrine system. So the organs of the endocrine system are scattered throughout the body, and generally they are tissues whose sole purpose is to create hormones. Now, they're not the only ones that make hormones. We'll touch on a couple of other tissues that do that as well. So the difference between an endocrine organ and another organ that also makes hormones is that this is their only job. And everybody else is kind of like, also we make hormones, but we have other functions as well. So the major processes where we see the endocrine system in charge instead of the nervous system are the reproductive processes, which we'll cover more at the end of the class, as well as growth and development, which we'll also cover later. It's also in charge of maintaining water balance, electrolyte balance, as well as nutritional balance, so mostly energy balance, but also other nutrient intakes. Also tends to regulate cellular metabolism and is sort of involved in mobilization of body defenses. That one's a little weird, but we'll touch on that too. And we'll talk about that more when we actually get the immune system, which is actually in charge of body defenses. But there's a weird little overlap that we'll talk about. So first, we're going to just tackle what hormones are and how they work. And just like everything else, hormones fit into categories. And the two main categories for these guys are water soluble, so whether they can dissolve in water, or water insoluble, which is basically the same thing as being lipid soluble. So we have lipid-based hormones and water-soluble hormones, which are typically amino acid-based. So the water-soluble ones cannot cross the plasma membranes, so they interact with the outsides of cells. And then the lipid-soluble ones, things that are lipid-soluble, are able to freely cross plasma membranes. And so they influence the cell from the inside. These guys are what we collectively refer to as steroid hormones, and they're actually all synthesized from cholesterol, which is another reason why cholesterol has major importance in the body. So if a hormone is going to have an influence on a cell, we call it a target cell, and they have to have receptors for that particular hormone. So we briefly talked about neurotransmitters and how they have different receptors. Well, this works the same way. It's just that there's no synapses involved. So not only do cells have to have receptors for a hormone in order to respond, but different cells can have different receptors for the same hormone and therefore have different responses to the same hormone. So just like we talked about a little bit in the nervous system, it's the receptors that determine a cell's response to binding, not the ligand, so not the hormone in this case. So because receptors are required, even though the endocrine system circulates hormones in the blood and exposes the entire body, we can still have these selective actions of the system based on receptor availability. And generally speaking, and we'll go into a smidge more detail later, when we have binding on receptors, we're going to alter the target cell's activity. So the things that can affect how, like to what extent we're altering target cell activity, assuming that they in fact have receptors, are going to be the blood levels of the hormone. So we call this the hormone concentration. The higher the concentration of the hormone in the blood, the more of them are going to bind to the target cells. And this number is variable. The endocrine organs can release more or less hormone as needed based on their feedback loops. The cells themselves can actually alter the number of receptors that they have for a hormone. So they can increase or decrease their sensitivity for the hormone by upregulating, so making more of, or downregulating, making less of the receptors. So if they have lots and lots of receptors, then the chances of even small amounts of the hormone binding are fairly high, which makes them very sensitive to the effects. And vice versa, if they don't have very many receptors, they're not going to be very sensitive to the effects of the hormone, even if there's a lot of it circulating. So these two things together make a big difference. And then the third one is how well the hormone binds to the receptor. So we call it an affinity of binding. Basically, sometimes they fit together really well, you know, like you put the right key in the lock. And sometimes it's just kind of okay. And so the better fit the receptor is for the hormone, the more of them are likely to actually bind. That one's a little bit less important for our purposes, but it does affect the cell's responses. So when we're changing cellular activity, it can happen a lot of different ways. And some fairly common responses are going to be changing membrane permeability. So just like when neurotransmitters bind, we can open or close ion channels and change membrane permeability or membrane potential. Often what we see is that we are altering the actual activity of the cell. So we can make more enzymes or proteins. We can turn on or off enzymes and cause entire metabolic pathways to occur or stop. We can encourage cells to actually make and secrete various products. We can even encourage cells to re-enter the cell cycle by stimulating mitosis. And so now we're getting cell division and increasing the growth of a tissue. In order to regulate hormone secretion, our endocrine organs are subjected to negative feedback loops. So we call these endocrine reflexes because just like a reflex arc in the nervous system is a negative feedback loop, so it is here as well. So hormone release is always going to be dependent on some sort of stimulus, which ones we'll talk about in a little bit. And stopping the release of hormones is usually based on a negative feedback loop, and which type varies, but there are some categories that are usually followed. So the stimuli that typically cause hormone release can fall into one of three categories. We'll talk about each one in turn. So humoral, neural, or hormonal. And note that yes, humoral and hormonal sound similar, but they are entirely different things. So humoral stimulus, the humoral stimulus is where endocrine glands release hormone in response to changes in blood levels of ions or nutrients. So way, way, way back before we really knew how the body worked, the fluids of the body were referred to as the humors. So you might have like black humors, white humors, yellow humors, whatever. And so we do refer to things in the blood sometimes as humors still, and that's where humoral comes from. We'll see this come up again when we get to the immune system. So that's what humoral means. So this could be things like we've already talked about before, right? Like calcium triggers, when it's too low, we trigger parathyroid release. And then when it gets high enough, we're gonna stop parathyroid release. So that's a humoral stimulus. And we'll touch on some nutrient-related ones too. So that's the simplest type of control, because typically whatever is triggering the stimulus is also the thing being regulated by that hormone. Neural stimulus is what we've talked about before. So we can have nerve fibers synapsing with endocrine cells across a chemical synapse. And so then the neurotransmitter release at that synapse will trigger hormone release. And when we talked about the adrenal medulla as part of the sympathetic nervous system, essentially we were also looking at neural stimulus of hormonal release, because norepinephrine and epinephrine then get released into the blood and act as hormones. And again, that's also a really great example of the overlap between the nervous system and the endocrine system. The last one is hormonal stimulus. So literally hormones can sometimes cause other endocrine organs to release other hormones. So we're going to talk about that at the beginning of our discussion of the whole system, because the hypothalamus, that part of the brain that is a major visceral control center, major homeostatic control center, it's going to do this, as well as that pituitary gland that it's attached to. On the other end of it, so as far as stopping the release of hormones, like I said, it's negative feedback loops typically. And often we see inhibition of secreting the hormones in response to the original hormone release. So one way or the other, the effects of the hormone cause inhibition of the release of the hormone. And very routinely, it's actually the product of the release that's going to cause this, but it can be other things as well. And we'll touch briefly on some specific examples. The advantage of this, though, is that it gives us nice narrow ranges of regulation, which makes it easier to maintain homeostasis, right? We don't want things to go too high or too low. And so often when the cause and effect of these things all links together, it's easier to maintain these ideal homeostatic ranges. So this is an example of our endocrine reflexes. So here we've got an imbalance. So now we're not in homeostasis. And in this example, we're showing low blood concentrations of a type of hormone called glucocorticoids that gets detected by the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus monitors the blood for lots of different parameters. So the hypothalamus is like, okay, we don't have enough glucocorticoids in the blood, kind of need them to be at a proper level. And so the hypothalamus releases a hormone that is a hormonal stimulus. So it's this hormone called corticotropin releasing hormone, and it causes a cascade. So the result is going to be interaction at the adrenal gland, which is the endocrine organ that makes glucocorticoids. And we're going to stimulate the release of glucocorticoids. Once the level gets to the appropriate homeostatic level, that's going to have a negative feedback effect on the hypothalamus, turning off the release of that hormone. So now everything's back in the right place, okay? So this is just kind of basic stimulus, response, negative feedback, inhibition. And we'll, as I said, look at a couple specific examples as we get to the appropriate organs. Okay, so that's our overview. Now we're going to talk about the specific organs of the endocrine system, and we're going to start with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland because they're kind of the master controllers of the entire system. So remember that the hypothalamus is part of the diencephalon in the brain, and it's kind of situated between the brainstem and the frontal lobes, right? And it's just underneath the thalamus, and it has both neural and endocrine functions. So it's our major overlap, our major tie between the two systems. And most of how it controls the endocrine system is by controlling the pituitary gland. And most of how it affects the nervous system is by controlling the autonomic output. So this is not something you need to know all of, but this is kind of just like an overview of how the hypothalamus controls a bunch of stuff. So we're going to talk about the pituitary gland and see how the hypothalamus controls endocrine output via the pituitary. So the pituitary gland is a major endocrine gland. It's not very big. It just kind of sits under or inferior to the hypothalamus. It's connected by this little infundibulum or stalk, and it's got two lobes, got an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. The anterior lobe makes 6 hormones, the posterior lobe makes 2. The anterior lobe is proper endocrine gland tissue, and its scientific name is the adenohypophysis, because the hypothalamus is also referred to as the hypophysis, and adeno refers to like glandular tissue. The posterior lobe is technically just an extension of the hypothalamus. So it's actually made of neural tissue, kind of like the adrenal medulla. And so it's referred to as the neurohypophysis because it's the nervous tissue of the pituitary. So it's all kind of set up like this. So here's the thalamus, cerebral cortex up here, brainstem down here. So here's the hypothalamus, and then the connection is the infundibulum, and then anterior and posterior lobes of the pituitary gland. Here's our little close-up of the pituitary gland. This is showing you stuff you don't need to know, which is a couple of little divisions of the anterior portion. We just care about anterior or adenohypophysis, posterior is neurohypophysis, connected to the hypothalamus by the infundibulum. So we'll start with the posterior pituitary because it's a little more straightforward. So the posterior pituitary is actually just the axons of neurons whose cell bodies are in the hypothalamus in a couple of different nuclei. So their axons come down through the infundibulum and they sit in a bed of blood vessels so that when they have nervous impulses, they release their product, which would normally be neurotransmitter, into the blood to act as hormones instead. So it's essentially just a storage area for hormones made in the hypothalamus, and those hormones are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. They then get transported down these axons into the pituitary to then get released when triggered up in the hypothalamus. So because axons in the central nervous system are called tracts, This pathway down the infundibulum is called the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. And I think I did that wrong earlier. The hypophysis is just the name for the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is just the hypothalamus. I don't know what I was thinking. And then these are just the divisions. If that wasn't, since I messed that up, sorry about that. So please correct that if you wrote that down. Anyway, so what do these hormones do? Why do we care about them? All right, so posterior pituitary hormones. These guys are amino acid based. If you're wondering, there are a couple of peptide hormones. Oxytocin, you may have heard of. It has a major role in childbirth by stimulating uterine contractions and encouraging the opening of the cervix, which we'll talk about when we get to the reproductive system. It also triggers milk ejection from the mammary glands. And in general, it's a neurotransmitter involved in bonding behavior. This includes between mothers and their newborns, but it can also be between any two people that share any sort of physical intimacy, especially eye contact, for some reason, triggers a lot of oxytocin release. Antidiuretic hormone, on the other hand, is completely different. It gets abbreviated as ADH. Hey, Jesus Christ. Can't win. And it was originally called vasopressin. So antidiuretic hormone makes us hold on to water. So we make less urine in order to retain as much water as possible. So a diuretic makes you lose water, so you pee out more water. So an antidiuretic has the opposite effect and makes you retain it. And it does that by acting at the level of the kidneys to tell you to do that. And it gets released when the hypothalamus is monitoring the concentration of ions in the blood by osmoreceptors. And it says, oh, you're getting a little dehydrated, don't pee out anything more than you have to. Now, the reason it's also called vasopressin is because given at really high levels, like you would in a lab when you're trying to figure out what something does, it can cause vasoconstriction and an increase in blood pressure. Vasoconstriction means contraction of the smooth muscle in the walls of blood vessels, which pushes on the blood more and increases your blood pressure. But it doesn't typically do that when it's released from the pituitary. It really only does that if you inject a bunch into somebody to see what it does. So antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. Because of oxytocin's role in bonding, it is also called the love hormone. Although we're still exploring all of its roles in person-to-person bonding. But it's definitely important in childbirth, milk letdown, and bonding between newborns and their parents. Okay, so that's our two posterior pituitary hormones. Anterior pituitary is a little more complicated. So the anterior pituitary is glandular tissue that makes its own hormones. And so the way that the hypothalamus controls that is that it has axons that come down and synapse at the beginning of the infundibulum. So cell bodies in the hypothalamus, synapses up here, and it's connected to this extensive blood supply. So when these guys are triggered, they release their neurotransmitters as hormones into this blood supply that then comes down the infundibulum and extensively circulates through the anterior pituitary, where those hormones can trigger the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary cells. Now, in order to do that, we have an artery here that becomes a capillary bed to absorb these neurotransmitters acting as hormones. And then it comes together as a vein, and then it becomes a second capillary bed to expose all these cells in the anterior pituitary. Whenever we have a capillary bed become a blood vessel, become a second capillary bed, we call it a portal system. And since this one is between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, it's called the hypophyseal portal system. So this means there's direct delivery of a hormonal stimulus for the hypothalamus to control the release of the anterior pituitary hormones. So the hormones from the anterior pituitary are these guys. We're going to go through them one at a time. This is just our overview list. And you'll note, even though I said 6, there's technically a 7th on here. I will address that shortly. So even though we only have 2 lobes to the pituitary, there's actually a bit more organization to it than that. And we're not going to go into a ton of detail on that, but there is a middle lobe in a lot of species. So it's called the pars intermedia, or the intermediate part or lobe. It makes different hormones. Now, we don't have the lobe, but we have the cells that exist in that lobe in other species. And so we can still make some of those hormones. And most of them, we don't know if they're actually important anymore or not. They might just be remnants. But this one, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, has some relevance. And so I just like to mention it, even though we're not going to spend a ton of time on it. So this is the primary hormone made by this intermediate lobe. It gets abbreviated to MSH. And we don't know 100% what its role is in adults. We know that before we're born, this hormone stimulates melanin production and distribution. So it influences where our melanocytes are and how much pigment they make. And then we know that it does correspond to whenever we make more pigment as adults. So for example, if you get too much sun and you tan, that's going to release this melanocyte-stimulating hormone so that they make more melanin. We know that there's interactions with other hormones so that whenever skin darkening occurs for whatever reason, this guy's involved, but we don't know that we're really needing it. So it's still a little bit interesting. We're learning more about that, but here's some more information on that. So your key here, though, is melanocytes. Obviously, it's going to act at the skin on our melanin-producing cells. In other species, it has a much larger role, especially in species that make different colored coats in the winter versus the summer. So this is a bunch of species where there's a nice big winter. This is their winter coat, and this is their summer coat. You can see that there's a big difference in the amount of pigment that is in there, and also to coat length to some extent. See, this box is not nearly as fuzzy in its summer coat. So there's definitely a role there, and since we don't do that, that role does not exist in people. All right, so now we'll hit the other guys. Again, this is a summary. I'm not going to go through it right now, but you can look back at it later, and hopefully it will help you study your way through these guys. So we're going to start with growth hormone. Growth hormone is also called somatotropin. I should point out that, I thought I had this, but I don't. Tropic hormones are ones that act as hormonal stimuli. So any hormone that causes the release of other hormones is a tropic hormone, and growth hormone is one of those. And whenever we're talking about the body, remember we use soma, so somatotropin, because it causes the release of other hormones in the body, and it's related to growth, which is why it's also called growth hormone. So this is the major anabolic hormone that drives growth both during childhood and throughout life. It has both metabolic and growth promoting actions, although interestingly, all of its growth related actions are indirect and not direct. Its direct actions are actually on metabolism. So it preps the body for growth by doing things like increasing our blood sugar levels, increasing our fatty acid levels, and encouraging cells to take up amino acids so that they're better able to make proteins. But in order to stimulate growth, it actually stimulates the release of other hormone-like molecules called insulin-like growth factors, or IGFs. Now, a ton of different tissues make IGFs, and so there's a lot of different ones, usually referred to by which tissue is making them, and we're not going to worry about that right now. And they're the ones that have more direct action on encouraging growth in other tissues. And they're called insulin-like growth factor because I think structurally they're similar to insulin, but they're the ones that actually have growth effects. And we do need some levels of this even after we're done growing through childhood, because it helps us with things like maintenance of body tissues, and anytime we're, you know, like needing to increase like our muscle mass or something for any reason, these guys are going to be involved. So although we're not going to spend a ton of time on how this works for every single hormone, I just want to touch on how the hypothalamus regulates growth hormone, because it's our best example of how this works. All right, so the hypothalamus completely regulates growth hormone secretion from the anterior pituitary. So it makes a hormone called growth hormone releasing hormone when it wants more growth hormone to be released, and it makes a hormone called growth hormone inhibiting hormone when it wants to stop growth hormone release. And this one's also called somatostatin, because it's when something's in stasis, it means it's stopped. So the release of both of these is going to be regulated by negative feedback loops from growth hormone and insulin-like growth factors, which basically means that the hypothalamus is monitoring the blood for levels of both of these hormones, and if there's not enough of them, it'll release this to cause more, and if there's too much of them, it'll release the inhibitor to stop it, okay? And that's gonna let it modify. There's other factors at play that influence which one the hypothalamus is releasing, but we're not gonna worry about that. So this is just an overview of how that works. So if we're releasing more growth hormone, it's because the hypothalamus is releasing growth hormone releasing hormone. So stimulus is going to be in here, action potentials, release at the synapse, travel down the blood, bind to the cells making growth hormone, which results in growth hormone release. And then we have all of the effects like circulating more fat in the blood, and circulating more glucose or more glucose production. And then, Jesus Christ, this is what I get for not closing my door. And then doing all that insulin-like growth factor stuff and increasing amino acid uptake in cells. And then if this stuff gets to be too much and the hypothalamus detects it, then we're going to have negative feedback, and it'll release the inhibiting hormone. So again, synapses from different nuclei here down this portal system, blood, interact with those cells that make the hormone, blocks release, okay? So we have these dueling negative feedback loops that, that maintain appropriate levels of growth hormone in the blood for whatever the body needs to be doing at that time. If you have any questions as we go through these different hormones, just let me know. That's as much detail as we'll really be getting into. And some of them we'll do a little bit less. So this next guy is quite a mouthful. It's Adrenocorticotropic Hormone. We abbreviate this to ACTH because nobody wants to say that all the time. But I want to show you that this just tells us exactly what it does. This is a completely descriptive name. So this is another hormone that causes the release of hormones, so it's tropic. And it causes the release of hormones from the adrenal cortex. So adrenal cortex hormone releasing hormone. That's its name. So it acts at the adrenal cortex to cause the release of corticosteroids, which is the general term for hormones of the adrenal cortex. We'll talk about those in a little bit. And generally speaking, the release of this stuff is controlled by a hypothalamic releasing hormone, and also then negative feedback by the products of the adrenal cortex. So some of these guys then negatively feedback to stop the release of ACTH, maintaining appropriate levels of adrenal cortical hormones. So this is a nice classical negative feedback loop. One of the most common stimuli to cause the release of all this is stressors. So if we're stressed out, this is more of our chronic stress response. The hypothalamus releases its corticotropin releasing hormone, which was our example before. So this goes down the portal system, down that blood pathway down the infundibulum, causes the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. This travels in the blood to the adrenal cortex, causes the release of corticosteroids. Those have actions that we'll talk about in a little bit, but they also negatively feedback at these higher levels, again, maintaining appropriate levels of hormones. All right, so we'll touch on those guys a little bit more when we get to the adrenal gland. Next up for anterior pituitary hormones, though, are two of them that are collectively called gonadotropins. So the gonads are the reproductive organs. We'll talk about them more when we get to the reproductive system. And again, tropins are going to be releasing, stimulating other hormones to release. So these are the hormones that control the gonads, both in men and women, although they're named for their effects in women. So one of them is follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, and the other one is luteinizing hormone, or LH. Both of them are triggered to be released by a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus called gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH, and they're inhibited by the hormones produced by the gonads. So testosterone from the testes in men and estrogen from the ovaries in women negatively feedback on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So hopefully you're detecting a theme here. Growth hormone's a little more complicated. Most everybody else makes do with one hormone control from the hypothalamus. Now the effects of these guys we'll talk about when we get to the reproductive system. So for now, we're just going to look at this beautiful little feedback loop and appreciate how nicely self-contained it is. And we'll talk about the functions of these hormones and these gonads when we get to the appropriate system. Next hormone is called prolactin. We abbreviate it PRL, and it stimulates milk production in women. That is its job. So if something is pro, it means it's for something, and lactation, so it's prolactin. They named it for what it does. So this works with oxytocin. So oxytocin stimulates the release of milk, but prolactin stimulates its production. And most of the time, release of milk is blocked or inhibited by an inhibitory protein from the hypothalamus, or hormone, sorry, called prolactin inhibiting hormone, which is actually the neurotransmitter dopamine, which I find interesting. But it's not the only thing that regulates lactation. There's a bunch of other factors, and we'll briefly touch on them when we get to the reproductive system, and we're not really going to worry about it beyond that right now. The last anterior pituitary hormone is thyroid stimulating hormone. Now it's also called thyrotropin because, again, it's going to cause the release of a second hormone in the thyroid gland, and we abbreviate this guy TSH. So TSH is necessary for the normal development and secretory activity in the thyroid gland. Its release is triggered by thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, or TRH. So again, we have this levels of control from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, and now to another endocrine organ, the thyroid. And thyroid hormone itself is the negative feedback inhibitor that inhibits the release of thyrotropin releasing hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone. So let's see how that works. Here's another summary slide of all the pituitary hormones, again, just to kind of help you study them, because this is a nicely organized chart. Please make sure you're learning your abbreviations as you go. So thyroid hormone is going to be the first one we talk about that's not in the hypothalamus or the pituitary gland. Thyroid hormone is produced and secreted by the thyroid gland. This is in your neck, so it's anterior to the trachea, and it kind of covers the trachea like a shield, which is where the name comes from. And it sits just below a cartilage in your throat called the thyroid cartilage that also sits as a shield. So they're both named for their resemblance to shields rather than anything else. Now the thyroid glands, actually a two-lobed gland that kind of looks like a butterfly. And so there's a left and a right side, and they're connected by an isthmus. Although how narrow that is variable. And you can see they sit right in between the carotid arteries, the major arteries that carry blood up to your brain. So this is a very well vascularized gland. And thyroid hormone itself is fairly complicated. So thyroid hormone is made and stored in follicles. So basically all the cells that make the hormone sit around a little pool of the hormone. And this is another one of those amino acid based ones. So it's stored as proteins called thyroglobulin. And then when it needs to be secreted, the cells just pull it out, chop it up, and send it on its way in the blood. There's actually two different forms of thyroid hormone that are secreted based on the number of iodine molecules that are present. So thyroid hormone is the reason why we need iodine in our diets, and it's pretty much the only thing that our body uses it for. So thyroxin is the form that has 4 iodines, and it's also called T4 because of it. And then triiodothyronine is the fancy one for T3, and that one has 3. So they're secreted in 2 forms. Most of it gets converted to T3 before it's used by different cells. And it's got major metabolic effects. This is a very important hormone in the body. So quick picture first of what I mean when I say follicles or colloid storage. So the follicular cells are the ones that are making this stuff and secreting it. So they make a bunch of it, they store it in here, and then whenever they need more, as informed by the TSH or thyroid stimulating hormone, they pull it out and circulate it. So thyroid hormone is the major metabolic hormone in the body. More thyroid hormone in the blood means a higher basal metabolic rate. This is your baseline. And it also means more body heat production. So the ability to stimulate metabolism is going to have a positive impact on how much heat we're producing as well. So we call this the calorigenic effect of thyroid hormone. And it's also needed for tissue growth and development. So thyroid hormone is also very important, especially as we're growing. If we don't have normal thyroid hormone levels when we're kids, we're not going to have normal skeletal system development. We're not going to have normal nervous system development. And then we need it throughout life to maintain appropriate basal metabolic rates, basal energy levels, and for appropriate reproductive function. It also helps us maintain blood pressure by making sure that our blood vessels are sensitive to the sympathetic nervous system. So higher levels of thyroid hormone are going to increase the number of receptors for the sympathetic nervous system in the blood vessels, which means that they will be more responsive to the effects of those neurotransmitters and hormones, so norepinephrine and epinephrine. So that's why if you are making too much thyroid hormone, you're going to have very high blood pressure, you'll have hypertension, can be bad for you, and you'll probably be kind of hungry. And the opposite happens if you have a low thyroid levels. You might not have a lot of energy, you might not be hungry, and yet you don't lose weight. And I suspect it might be cold as well. So either way, it's not good, and that's why we commonly test for this. Thyroid glands go awry often, and they're very important. But luckily, we can treat them and supplement them as needed. So here's our summary slide of the different effects of thyroid hormone, just like we had one for the ones I showed you before. And this also shows you the negative feedback, where higher levels of thyroid hormone are going to inhibit the release of the releasing hormones. Low levels are going to increase that release, so that we're trying to maintain homeostasis. All right. So I typically do this stuff in sort of an anatomical route from your brain on down. So we're going to cover the next gland, which is also in your neck, and it's called the parathyroid glands, producing parathyroid hormone, and they actually sit on the posterior, so the back of the thyroid glands. We have these 4 little pea-sized parathyroid glands, and they're just kind of like that. So they're 4 separate glands, but they all act together. And as we talked about before, parathyroid hormone is the major regulator of calcium levels in the blood. So I'm not going to go over the details of this because we already covered it in the skeletal system. We're just going to take a little bit more of a look at the glands themselves. So this is a posterior view. So the thyroid hormone is sitting on the anterior aspect of the trachea and the larynx, and you can see our 4 little parathyroid glands right there. So recall that this is a humorally regulated endocrine gland. So this guy works independently of the hypothalamus and the pituitary. It's solely based on calcium levels. So when calcium levels get too low, the cells in the parathyroid gland are monitoring that. They release more parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone is going to cause release of calcium from bone, retention of calcium in the kidneys, as well as release of vitamin D, which then causes absorption of calcium from the digestive system. Once calcium levels get high enough, it's going to inhibit the release of parathyroid hormone and incidentally cause the release of calcitonin, which doesn't really have very strong effects, but it'll help with the inhibiting. And then we're gonna stop this effect. So that's gonna help us maintain homeostasis. And then if it got too high, then the calcitonin would cause calcium to be deposited back on the bone to help the levels drop. But if they get too low, we go back to this again. So 2 hormone, dueling negative feedback loops, calcium homeostasis, very important, but we've covered it before. So one other thing to point out here is that this is a good example of the fact that the endocrine system is not all intimately tied together. So this all happens independently of all of that control that we already talked about. And calcitonin, by the way, is actually made by the thyroid gland, by the cells that don't make thyroid hormone, but we're not going to worry about that because we don't have time. All right, so another one that actually has nothing to do with the hypothalamus or the pituitary gland is the thymus. The thymus is actually part of the immune system. And I really don't know, to be honest, why books typically include it, but I'm just going to point it out because it comes up, and then we're going to talk about it more when we get to the immune system and the lymphatic system. So it actually sits like right above your heart, in the middle of your chest, and most people don't know about it. It's quite small when you're an adult, but it's fairly large when you're a kid, and this is where our T cells or our T lymphocytes come from. And the reason why it gets included in the endocrine system is because the thymus produces hormones that regulate the development of these immune cells. So we'll talk about all of this a little bit more when we get to this system. But for now, we just need to know this is where T lymphocytes or T cells come from, and there are hormones involved in that development. They're called thymosin collectively, and that's all they do. They don't do anything else. So I always get annoyed by this because it's really immune stuff that happens to have hormones involved. But anyway, some people include it in the endocrine system, so there you go. All right, moving our way inferiorly down the body gets us to the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands, you'll also see them called the suprarenal glands, depending on what book you use. Either way, it's just referring to their location, remember, as little hats on top of the kidneys. Now, the adrenal glands produce a variety of hormones, but in general, all of them are helping us deal with stress. They're all to help the body adjust to dealing with stress. Now, the adrenal glands, remember, are organized into two regions. So there's a central medulla. Oops, that's the kidneys. There's a central medulla and an outer cortex. We talked about the medulla already. It's the neuroendocrine cells of the sympathetic nervous system producing norepinephrine and epinephrine. But we haven't talked about the cortex yet. So we're going to spend a little bit more time on that. So the adrenal cortex is actually 3 different layers of endocrine cells producing different types of hormones. Collectively, we refer to them as corticosteroids because they are all steroid hormones synthesized from cholesterol, and they're coming from the cortex of the adrenal gland. Now, unlike thyroid hormone, which we talked about before, this is not stuff that gets stored. This only gets released, or this only gets produced as needed and released immediately. So this is a little bit different from something like thyroid hormone, where we actually have like 3 months of it stored up. Most hormones work more like this, where they are not really stored, they're just stimulated to be produced, released, and we're not keeping a bunch of extra around. So remember your little adrenal gland diagrammies. So here's the layers, and we'll work through each one of these as we go. So this is the outermost layer, and then this is the deepest layer here. So here's the adrenal medulla. And remember, we know those guys: sympathetic nervous system, epinephrine, norepinephrine. Okay, so we've got, these guys are all the different parts of the cortex. They're named as zones. So we have zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. Now, unfortunately, these names are based on the physical appearance of the different layers when looked at under a microscope, and that's not super helpful for us. So I will explain it to you, but then you'll have to find another way to kind of remember which zone makes what. So glomerulosa are little balls, so they thought the tissue looked like it was arranged in little circles or spheres. Fascicles, remember we learned about fascicles in the muscular system. Fascicles typically are arranged in basically like columns. That's where that comes from. And then reticularis is our reticular pattern striking again. So somebody thought this kind of looked like little rectangle-y things, and they named it reticularis. Cool. As you can see, they all make different types of hormones. So although these are all corticosteroids, they're not all the same kind. So the zona glomerulosa makes a group of them called mineralocorticoids, which have to do with electrolyte balance, so minerals, right, or inorganic molecules. The zona fasciculata makes glucocorticoids, which are going to mostly have to do with blood sugar or blood glucose levels. And then the zona reticularis makes gonadotropins, referring to the gonads. So these guys are sex hormones related to the ones made in the ovaries and the testes. Touch on that in a second. So the mineralocorticoids, there's one that's made predominantly. So 95% of the mineralocorticoids are one called aldosterone. So we're just going to talk about aldosterone going forward because it's really the only one of importance. Its job is to regulate electrolyte balance in the extracellular fluid, that's ECF. And it's mostly concerned with sodium, secondarily concerned with potassium. It also regulates water balance because water inevitably follows sodium. So if we're getting rid of some sodium, we're going to get rid of some water. If we keep sodium, we're going to keep water. And it works at the level of the kidneys. So when aldosterone levels are high, we're going to lose less sodium in the urine by encouraging the kidneys to reabsorb it. So just like parathyroid hormone makes the kidneys reabsorb more calcium, aldosterone makes the kidneys reabsorb more sodium. Now, a secondary effect of sodium retention or sodium reabsorption is potassium loss. So the charges have to balance when we make urine. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to the urinary system. And so in order for the body to hold on to sodium, it has to lose potassium. Although sometimes it loses acids as hydrogen ions instead. This is called ion exchange. And so it regulates potassium in a secondary manner because potassium gets lost simply because we're trying to retain sodium. So this is our little flow chart of how that works. Now, if potassium levels in the blood get too high, aldosterone will be released specifically with the purpose of getting rid of some of that potassium. But either way, either potassium levels in the blood get too high or sodium levels in the blood get too low, and we're going to trigger aldosterone release from the adrenal cortex. So again, the primary releaser here is humoral, and it's not related to the hypothalamus or the pituitary gland. Now we're just going to go a short distance here, although we're circulating in the blood, so there's more to it than that. But we're going to go to the kidneys, and we're going to tell the kidneys, hold on to sodium, get rid of potassium, and then when the levels of these two electrolytes are balanced, that's mostly going to turn off the release of aldosterone. So a humoral negative feedback loop, as well as humoral regulation of hormonal release. Glucocorticoids, on the other hand, are quite different. So glucocorticoids have an impact on the energy metabolism of most of the cells in the body. And their purpose is to help us resist stressors. So under normal circumstances, and why we think they were originally evolved and why they originally worked in the body was because, you know, we don't usually constantly eat, although we have that option sometimes now. And way back in the day when we had to like hunt for our food and stuff, we really didn't have that option at all. So sometimes we have food in our digestive system providing us with blood sugar and stuff, and sometimes we don't. And so glucocorticoids are supposed to help us deal with the fact that sometimes our blood sugar levels might drop, and also our blood pressure. So this is a catabolic hormone in that it encourages us to break down larger molecules into smaller ones to then be released into the blood to help us maintain our blood sugar levels. Now, glucocorticoids also have major functions as anti-inflammatories and at prolonged high levels as immune suppressors. And this is why when there's too much of it for too long, which is basically when we're exposed to really chronic stress, it can have bad effects on the body. But under normal circumstances, it's just trying to maintain our blood sugar levels and generally help us through intermittent fasting. So just like with the mineralocorticoids, where some are more common than others, the major glucocorticoid is cortisol, but there are others, and they're all just kind of cortico named, which again just refers to the cortex of the adrenal gland. So the things that the glucocorticoids stimulate. Gluconeogenesis is the formation of glucose from fats and proteins. This is primarily at the level of the liver. Also mostly stimulating the liver, but also adipose tissue. We're gonna cause an increase in blood levels of glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids. And the idea here is that the brain has to use glucose. It doesn't really have a choice. So we make sure there's enough glucose for the brain, and then the fatty acids and amino acids are for the rest of the body to use instead of using glucose. And then in order to help maintain blood pressure, which is its other major function, glucocorticoids enhance vasoconstriction that is already being performed by the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is often activated at the same time, and it causes vasoconstriction to maintain blood pressure, and so this is enhancing that effect rather than doing it on its own. So this is a little bit of an overview of the various effects of glucocorticoids. Some of them are good and some of them are bad. Basically, prolonged effects are going to have are going to be worse, and it's made to be used more for short term. Now, glucocorticoids are the major ones that have a negative feedback on the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So adrenocorticotropin releasing, or Adrenocorticotropic hormone, its major purpose is to cause the release of glucocorticoids, although it does release all corticosteroids. And so as a result of that, cortisol especially is the hormone that's going to negatively feedback at the levels of the pituitary and the hypothalamus. And then again, the trigger here, the stimulus, is stressors. So this is very much a nervous stimulus as well as a hormonal stimulus as far as what gets this whole system going. And collectively, we do refer to this as our stress response. The last one is really the least understood. So the gonadotropins from the zona reticularis are the adrenal sex hormones. Most of them are weak androgens. Androgens are the sex hormones that tend to have masculinizing effects, although they are important in both men and women. And tissues will transform these into either testosterone or estrogen before they have their effects. So after puberty, these guys aren't necessarily super important because the levels of hormones produced by the gonads are much higher, especially when we're dealing with the levels of testosterone produced by the testes in men. But we think that their major effects are before puberty, so helping provide sex hormones before puberty and before the gonads are fully functional, and also as a source of androgens in women, as well as a source of sex hormones in women in general after menopause. So they definitely have important functions, but we're not as clear on what those functions are compared to how well we understand aldosterone and the mineralocorticoids and cortisol and the glucocorticoids. Okay, so that's the gonadotropins. So last up, just to touch on it so that it's covered properly, the adrenal medulla, of course, as an extension of the sympathetic nervous system. And this one is also a neuron triggered release, because it's the sympathetic nervous system that's going to cause this release of hormones activated by short-term stress. And so the effects of these catecholamines are going to be the same as, but more widespread than the sympathetic nervous system. So we're going to cause vasoconstriction and an increase in heart rate, that's tachycardia, to increase blood pressure. We're going to preferentially send blood to the heart and skeletal muscles and decrease it to things like the digestive system and other organs. And then we're also going to increase blood sugar levels. So you can see how the glucocorticoids and the adrenal medulla definitely act together for stress-related responses, because we're seeing overlap in blood sugar and blood pressure regulation here. And that's the best I can do for finding a negative feedback loop specifically involving corticosteroids and stress. So we call this relationship where the hypothalamus controls things via the pituitary. So we call them axes. So this one is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which mostly deals with glucocorticoids. As we'll talk about when we get to the reproductive system, there's also a hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis as far as influencing the ovaries or the testes as well. But we'll talk about that later. And then just to make sure you guys have some good pictures, you don't have to identify this anatomically, but I do think it, well, no, not really. Just to give you more pictures, I guess. Okay, so a couple more things. The pineal gland, remember we touched on that as part of the brain, as the epithalamus of the diencephalon, but it's very much an endocrine organ because it secretes melatonin. It secretes more melatonin when there's no light out, right? So it peaks at night, very low levels in the middle of the day, and that's how we have tracking for our circadian rhythm, which is our 24-hour pattern or cycle. And we call this a diurnal pattern because we as human beings are made to be awake in the day and asleep at night, although there are, I'm sure, individuals that don't follow that. Now, the way that the pineal gland knows when it's light or dark out is because there are connections between the optic nerves and the pineal gland, so along that visual pathway for detection of light. And then the melatonin goes and acts on the hypothalamus, which actually houses the biological clock that maintains our circadian rhythm and influences our sleep and wake cycles and other related cycles to that. So makes, you know, when we feel sleepy, when we feel awake, when we feel hungry even related to that, and then can get definitely messed up when we're changing time zones. So I know we just talked about that, but there's our pineal gland. And you can see its relationship to the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So like I said, a lot of other tissues, a lot of other organs actually make hormones. And we're still learning exactly what the roles of a lot of these are. So we're going to talk about some of them later, and some of them we're not really going to talk about at all. Well, I guess thymus, it depends. But we're going to touch on the pancreas a little bit for its endocrine effects, and then we'll talk about its exocrine effects later. And like I said, we'll get to the gonads as well as the placenta, which is the temporary organ of pregnancy. We get to the reproductive system. So we'll just touch on the pancreas here. The pancreas isn't technically part of the endocrine system. It's technically part of the digestive system, but it has these super important endocrine roles too. So I just want to talk about that because we usually don't have time to talk about it when we get to the digestive system. The pancreas is like the ultimate gland because it has both exocrine gland parts to it and endocrine gland parts to it. Now, the exocrine gland parts are directly related to the digestive system, and we'll talk about them when we get to that system. The endocrine functions are also related to digestion because they're all about glucose regulation. But as we've already mentioned, several other endocrine organs do glucose regulation as well. So although these guys are important, they're not alone in dealing with blood sugar levels, although they are some major players. So the parts of the pancreas that contain endocrine tissue are called pancreatic islets. It's kind of like island. So we have these little spots of endocrine tissue amidst a bunch of exocrine tissue. And there's different cell types for the different hormones. So the beta cells make insulin, which is our hypoglycemic hormone because it causes a decrease in blood sugar when it is released. And then our alpha cells make glucagon, which is our hyperglycemic hormone because it increases blood sugar levels when it is released. Along with, as we've mentioned, growth hormone, glucocorticoids, and epinephrine. So here's the pancreas. It sits in a little curve of intestine here. This is the duodenum. And we'll talk more about that later. These little bluey bits are showing you the endocrine parts, and they, of course, release hormone into the blood. So glucagon is triggered. No, that didn't work. Glucagon is triggered by hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. It can also be triggered to release by the sympathetic nervous system, as well as by increased levels of amino acids, because our body assumes that when our amino acid levels go up, it means we've eaten something that probably also has, or that, never mind, don't worry about that. Anyway, so if we eat a high protein meal, we can release this as well, if it's not also a high sugar meal. So this says that it targets the liver, and causes the liver to release glucose. So we're increasing blood glucose levels by making the liver produce some. Now the opposite occurs with insulin. Insulin and glucagon are opposing hormones. So high blood sugar levels, hyperglycemia, triggers the release of insulin from those beta cells. Now, unlike glucagon, which targets the liver, insulin targets most of the body. The exceptions are the liver, the kidneys, and the brain. So most cells in the body cannot bring glucose into the cell without insulin also present. So it promotes transportation of glucose into cells and is actually required. And it tells the liver to stop making and releasing glucose because we're getting plenty of it from the digestive system. Now, the liver, the kidneys, and the brain do not need insulin in order to take up glucose, but the rest of the body does. And that's because the brain is really bad at using anything else. It needs glucose. And then the liver deals with extra glucose and stores it. And the kidney kind of does the same thing on a lesser level. So this is our overall blood sugar regulation when we're looking just at glucagon and insulin. So high levels of blood sugar stimulate insulin secretion, which tell the liver to store blood sugar and tell everybody else to use it. That's going to result in blood sugar decreasing. If it gets too low, then we're going to stimulate glucagon secretion, which tells the liver to make and release glucose by breaking down the stores of it or making it from other molecules. And that's going to increase blood sugar levels. If they get too high, we release the insulin again, and around we go. Now, other factors here, of course, are other hormones that have blood sugar raising effects and whether or not we are eating. But we'll talk about that part when we get to the digestive system. All right, so this is the extensive one in your textbook about blood sugar homeostasis as well. You don't need to know any more than what's in the slides, but if you want to use this to help you study, just don't worry about learning the details that are beyond what we talked about, okay? Okay, so then the gonads, like I said, we're going to talk about their effects later, but the interesting thing about them is that they are also endocrine and exocrine glands. So they make the sex hormones, but they also make cells, and that makes them exocrine glands because they're secreting something out of ducts. So eggs and sperm make our gonads exocrine too, just like the pancreas, which is weird and interesting. All right, that's the endocrine system in a nutshell. Does anybody have any questions? Any questions about this lecture? All right, so if you haven't seen the nervous system worksheet, it is up in the practice quizzes. There will be an endocrine one going up tomorrow as well. Please study, if you haven't already started studying the nervous system as well as this endocrine lecture. On Wednesday, I will take any questions you guys have, review any concepts that you have questions about, and discuss the details of the exam, although it will basically be the same setup as the last one that we took. You're welcome to email me in the meantime. I think I've caught everybody's emails. If you sent me one recently, I might have missed it because one of my settings got messed up, but I've got them working again. So I should be catching all your emails as they come in. So again, any questions right now? The test is, yes, currently set to go live on Friday. Although I can definitely make it available through Saturday if anybody needs that. Any other questions? Yeah, if Saturday works better, I can definitely make it available Friday and Saturday. So the worksheet is under quizzes. Hold on. So just to show you this. So if you go under quizzes, there's a nervous system one here, and then the endocrine system one will show up as well. I have to throw some things in there. I wanted to make you a special senses one. I'm not really sure I'm going to have time as other things. have taken longer than I expected. So that's probably not happening, but there'll be an endocrine one up tomorrow, and that'll give you a chance to look at some things and help you test some concepts before our review and help you prep and study for the test. Okay, any other questions? All right, nobody else has questions. That is the lecture for today, and I will see you all on Wednesday.